Security over in the University of Leeds. And I'm sure those of us who are in the law school here at Queen's would very much like to claim Conor's successes as a former PhD student in the School of Law. So it's been a long-term aim of mine to be able to invite Conor back, ideally in person, but we do what we can with Teams to invite Conor back to talk about his research. And Conor has been hugely successful and hugely active in the areas around transnational crime, kidnapping, policing and security, and colonial policing. And over the last number of years has been leading and working on some really fascinating and very topical, but also I imagine very difficult projects in Mexico. So I am delighted to welcome Conor here today and to hear this research seminar on citizen responses to kidnap risk in the US-Mexico borderlands. So I will hand over to Conor. And as usual, I know you're all very familiar with the Teams etiquette, but could I just remind those of you who are joining us today to keep your cameras off and your microphones on mute until we come to the question and answer part. So Conor, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction, Cheryl. And a big weight of expectation now.
No pressure.
I'm not sure how often I've been referred to as a success story, but yeah, it's lovely to be connected with Queen's, and it's lovely to be back presenting to an audience at Queen's. You know, it's been a while since I was in Belfast, but it's always good to go back. And I did see the new building, and it looks very nice. So maybe some other opportunity I'll be there to listen to someone else present rather than me present in the future. It's great to see Bryce and a few of the other names there that I've heard of. So the presentation today, I'll just open the PowerPoint. Hopefully you can see this now, but if you can't, just yell at me. I can't see the chat when I do this. But the paper today is called The Intimacy Distance Paradox, Exploring Citizen Responses to Kidnap Risk in US-Mexico Borderlands. And as Cheryl was saying, I've been working on kidnapping since 2016 on this project. It's one of these big projects that I'm not sure when, if ever, it will end, but it's been a really fascinating one, and it's been very interesting for me to sort of remove myself a bit from the comfort zone of things that are more familiar and branch out into a new type of crime that I had touched on a little bit before, but nothing had really prepared me for what we were going to be looking at. So it's research that, like many of us, got stalled with the pandemic. So it's great to have this opportunity to revisit it again. And I'm looking at the intimacy distance paradox and citizen responses to kidnap risk in the US-Mexico borderlands. One of the ways I thought might be useful to start it out was putting up this image, this picture, which is of Juarez during the time that kidnapping was most pronounced and was sort of really depopulizing the city of Juarez, desertifying it. Everything was empty. And it's by an artist called Antonio Castro. And myself and the postdoc, Camilo, stumbled on this when you're doing what you do. When you're doing field work, you go to museums and stuff on the weekend. But it really captured what they called the epoch of violence, with shops boarded up, empty streets, families fleeing, and a sort of exodus from the place. And, you know, this is one of the things, you know, these cities like Juarez, like Tijuana, where we did the research, there's lots of different forms of violence that went on, but kidnapping had a particular place in how it eroded the public spaces, the sense of community, the civil life within these places. So it's a very sort of, you can see the fear and insecurity in people's places and the other things there. And it's one that sort of struck us when we were doing the field work. But before getting into the sort of more finer details of the actual paper, I thought it was useful to set out two sort of underpinning assertions, which I think are really important for this presentation. And the first is that kidnapping must be examined with a highly nuanced and contextualized research approach. Because the truth is, I think when most of us think about kidnapping, you know, well, or at least when I started doing this, we thought of economic kidnapping, we thought of political kidnapping, we thought of maybe tiger kidnapping linked to robberies and stuff. But one of the things that struck me is it's a kind of Western notion of what kidnapping is, because kidnapping, when we got to Mexico, was a very, very complex thing with practical dimensions that were complex and mutating. It wasn't just for ransom, it was for labor in the sex trade, labor in the narco trade, and forced recruitment into cartel and organized crime activities, kidnapping for intimidation, kidnapping between gangs, so many different levels of it. And then kidnapping was not a sort of static thing, it was a fluid type of crime, and that a lot of kidnappings ended up with disappearances, ended up with homicides. And then in the context of migrant kidnapping, you had people who were kidnapped and then ended up participating in kidnapping activities as moving from the victim to the perpetrator. And there's all these fluid and mutating dynamics that just related to the Mexican context. And I think if you went to other affected contexts in the global South with big problems of kidnapping, you'd see this variation. So I think in the Western developed world, we hear about aid workers, engineers, journalists who get kidnapped when they go to far off places. But quite often, local communities are much more affected in multiple diverse ways. So this is a really important underpinning thing to think about, to sort of move from the sort of maybe the Western notion of what we think kidnapping is to a much more complex notion of what kidnapping is in these sites that are affected by it. The other thing that's really important for this paper is the concept of intimacy. And intimacy, probably the first thing, is some kind of physical and emotional co-presence is what we think about. But intimacy in the context of this paper is a much broader sociological understanding of intimacy. In a sense, it's to do with shared knowledge, shared values. It's something that's much broader beyond individuals. It speaks to communities, it speaks to friendships, it speaks to business arrangements. And it's that wider sense of intimate life that is affected in the context of kidnapping. Kidnapping was referred to by Rolando Ochoa in a recent monograph, a really good book about elites in Mexico City as an intimate crime. But Rolando doesn't really get into expanding out on what the notion of intimacy is. Something that is clear is that kidnapping and intimacy, for some obvious and less obvious reasons, are really interlinked. And that's something I'll draw out through the paper. So in terms of the underpinning project, it was a Newton Fund project called Mobile Solutions to the Mexican Kidnapping Epidemic, Beyond Elite Countermeasures Towards Citizen-Led Innovation. It started in 2016, ran to 2019, but we're still working on it. We're still doing impact acceleration work linked to it. And I very much imagine I'll continue working on kidnapping for years to come, because it's actually one of these big crime problems that I think has been quite neglected within academia. Now, the project itself centers on one key research question or research challenge. How do you counter kidnapping when you cannot access private solutions or rely on the state? And this is the problem which many ordinary Mexican citizens find themselves confronting. So if you're wealthy, if you're privileged and a member of the elite, you have economic capital, you have political capital that you can leverage to insulate yourself to some degree from the threat. An upshot of that has been that the threat has moved and been displaced to lower and middle classes. Also, migrants are targeted as well. So the challenge is, what can you do to help those in that situation? And in the project, we are trying to bring together the knowledge regarding citizen-led initiatives regarding counter-kidnapping, to synthesize these and build up tools for regular people confronting the threat, and also looking at the specifics of transborder effects and transnational solutions. And it's a second work package, which will tie in to what I'd like to talk about in the paper today. And in that context, we did fieldwork in the US-Mexico border region, in the transborder metropolitan hubs of Juarez and El Paso and Tijuana, San Diego, as well as doing some fieldwork for comparative lessons on how you deal with kidnapping from Colombia, so doing interviews in Bogota and in Medellin. So that's the sort of background project. But then to focus in on kidnapping in the Transborder, the northern borderlands of Mexico. So it's useful maybe to say a little bit about the field which we worked in, and this image captures it. This is from a bridge with Juarez on the left and El Paso on the right. And it's one big city really, with the border wall running between it and the dry river of the Rio Grande in the middle. And what you have is a city on the left that's characterized by mass insecurity and this very negative reputation, and a city on the right, or the other half of the city, the American half of the city on the right, where you have very, very secure place, a presence of pretty much every security and intelligence agency, maybe a few exceptions, of the United States, and then this militarized border in the middle. And one of the things that happens is that kidnapping is about immobility, in the sense that it deprives people of their liberty. It keeps them they're kept in confinement, all these things. But it also triggers mobilities. Requests flow north to people on the northern side of the border, to family members who are now in the United States. Ransom payments flow the other way. Cross-border kidnappings happen, increasingly more so between gangs, but there was also famous incidents of the agent who was kidnapped on the southern side of the border. And also, there's mobilities triggered to the mobilizations and the protests of people about the kidnap risk and the flow of people across the border to get away from kidnapping. The other thing that's important is to think of kidnapping not just as a crime of immobility, but as I said, as a crime of intimacy. And in the paper, I'm going to talk about the intimacy distance paradox. And to summarize this up, is that something that really came through in the field work was that in seeking to preserve the relationships which people had with their loved ones, so their friends, their family, their colleagues, they inserted distance within that relationship. So to preserve your intimate bond with that person, you actually create distance from that person. And this distance took multiple forms, which I'll talk about, but reducing your social circle, not sharing personal information, moving across the border, lots of different aspects. Also fatalism about how you would even deal with kidnapping if it happened. So going back to the first one about how kidnapping shaped border mobility, this is just a snapshot of some of the different actors and what I call transborder mobile subjects that were linked to the kidnapping dynamics. I won't get into detail on these because of talking about the intimacy distance paradox, but it just gives a flavor of how many different mobilities were triggered by kidnapping. The first being that those who are wealthy and privileged and had access to investor visas or had dual nationality would move just across the border. And we had this transborder mobile elite where part of the family usually would move to the safer place just across the border. And some of them would use private security to get back across the border, especially those involved with M.A.K.E. Ladora factories. Another cross-border mobility was that of asylum seekers, those who had been targeted for kidnapping, those who were relatives of people who had been kidnapped, and sought to rely on kidnapping to cross over into the United States. This is a real challenge for people. One of the people we interviewed was an asylum lawyer, and it was highly problematic because obviously a lot of the complaints related to law enforcement, the threat that it posed, and of course with a very restricted media coverage of these issues, it was very hard for them also to build up cases as well. Now, additionally, undocumented migrants and the smuggling of migrants that everybody is aware of, from people passing from Central America through Mexico into the United States, their precarious travel made them highly vulnerable to kidnapping. In a recent paper by Caitlin Yates and Stephanie Letert, they estimate that it could be up to 250,000 over a 12-year period, the number of migrants that were kidnapped. Kidnapping statistics are highly problematic, but we're dealing in the thousands. We're dealing at an industrial level of kidnapping. And of course, for asylum seekers and undocumented migrants who get deported back, often they're getting left in places just across the border that they weren't familiar with, where again, they stood out and could be targeted for kidnapping. So these are just some of the mobilities that link to kidnapping and the border. So moving to the issue of intimacy and kidnapping. Kidnapping is a phenomenon that is at once both intimate and taboo, as well as public and societally pervasive in its effects. So when I say it's taboo, one of the things that we found in the research was that people were people were scared and reticent to talk about it. They actually were almost superstitious in the sense that they felt that if they talked about it, if they planned for kidnapping, what they would do if it happened to them or a member of family. They talked about the law of attraction, that it might, just by talking and thinking about it out loud, they would bring it towards them. So it's weird that you have a very pervasive insecurity that people are reticent to talk about. And that was a challenge we had to face in the project. What was also clear was that kidnapping was very public in certain ways. So some of the images on the right-hand side of the screen demonstrate that. The first one is a plaque from Paseo de Reforma, the main avenue in Mexico City, where at the top of it you do these memorial plaques to people who've been kidnapped and disappeared, Secuestrado y Desaparecido. And the bottom two images are linked to kidnapping, and the top one is a house that had been used by the Arellano Felix cartel, a safe house that had been confiscated and closed up by the police in Tijuana. And then the poster, we're looking for this person who's gone missing. So in Ingrid Hernandez's work, she spotlights how kidnapping is something where you see intimate aspects of people's lives and suffering, but we find it in public spaces. So again, we see the issue of intimacy and kidnapping intersecting. So moving towards how kidnapping became manifest in these border cities. It's hard to pinpoint when kidnapping exactly becomes a problem on the border, because there's different dynamics from what happens in Mexico City. But in our field work, the response tied into the war on drugs and the increased movement of the military towards the border. One of the phrases used by a respondent was, the problem came with the military. But in terms of the manifestation of it in moving through different sectors of border society, what we see is that it started targeting different forms of visible wealth. And because of the dynamics of the border, that, there's certain things you can do in the US and certain things you can do in Mexico, and some things that are cheaper one side, obviously in Mexico. A big industry in border cities is medical tourism, where you have these huge medical sectors for people who don't have insurance in America that come across to do treatments in Mexico. So doctors became one of the very first groups to be targeted by kidnappers. In 1 year, you had 40 doctors kidnapped in Tijuana. And this is one of these things that speaks to the sort of impact on social life in these places, because a doctor's surgery, something that should be open, welcoming, and about being healed, became a place that was, concerned about the security risks, that were anonymized, that were heavily protected, that put in panic buttons, all of these measures because of the threat of kidnapping. And doctors tried to anonymize their lives as well. And one of the consequences of this was that doctors became sort of key actors within civil society reactions against kidnapping. Another sector that suffered because of kidnapping was the restaurant sector. Again, one that had benefited massively from people coming across the border. But once the insecurity rose, the parties were over, the restaurants were empty. And as well as being targeted themselves, the restaurateurs, they had in this bizarre situation where one of our respondents who owned chains of restaurants says that the cartels and the organized crime groups that were doing the kidnapping were known clients. So when we talk about intimacy and the threat, the people they were serving were the people that they knew were doing the kidnapping. And this in Tijuana links to the sort of insertion of the specific organized crime groups within the sort of social life of that place, and it revolving around them. The other industry then that gets targeted is the maquiladoras, the factories that are on the border, with increased security put in place for the owners who would sometimes travel across in convoys of buses, special security measures from firms such as First Call to insulate themselves from the risk. So you have things like cars with inbuilt GPS trackers, with little lights that will trigger that will show that the microphone's on and they're being listened to, just in the case that something happens and they're targeted for a carjacking or kidnapping. So this is the first wave of kidnapping hitting the border region and working its way through these industries. And so it provokes this mass insecurity and this emptying of public space in these cities. And when I was reading over notes and things for this presentation, I was thinking about the lives we've led in this last year, where we've been restricted because of the pandemic. We limit our contacts. We don't go out. We don't socialize the way we did, and to a degree, public space is emptied. And it's similar there, only that the threat was a much more visceral and violent one. And so we have this autocontention, the self-isolation that people engaged in, that limiting their contact, staying at home more, not going out, to the extent that one of our respondents in Tijuana talked about how she gained 20 kilos because of the insecurity there. And she just wouldn't do things like go out to do exercise, go to the gym. It had many different effects on the lives of people in these cities, the fear of kidnapping. So the quote says at the bottom, parents were scared to take their children to parks because kids were being targeted for kidnapping. So people retreat in this first stage of secession, right? Retreating away from the threat. They retreat into gated communities. They reduce their links with other people. They remove visible displays of wealth, and security protocols become part of everyday practice. So that the things of messaging people when you come back, when you get home at the end of the night, checking in regularly when you're out of the house, people traveling in groups when they go places, even in some of the parts of the city, people barricading their streets, putting up their own checkpoints. We spoke with people who would vet those who joined their gated community or applied to join their gated community. Range of measures evolve, and this is why Kuhn calls it the kidnapped city, because the immobilizing effects of kidnapping spreads so far through the city. And this plays into a sort of feeling of distrust that gets proliferated because of kidnapping. Ochoa has referred to the treason phenomena, which means that in the vast majority of kidnapping cases, it's someone who knows the victim who has given them away. So because of this, people are very reticent about hiring staff, sharing information with colleagues, all of these things, because it could be a disgruntled family member, a disgruntled employee, someone with financial difficulties that is the one who is the source of betrayal. And for those who we interviewed who'd experienced kidnapping firsthand, the question which always remained was, who was it that gave me away? Who was it that passed this insecurity to me? And that sort of distrust then filters out within the wider society. And a phenomenon that accentuated that further was what was called las listas. In that if you had been kidnapped and you're going to be released, one of the things that the gangs would do was they would make you give up a list of other targets. So whilst the number of people that you had to give up varied depending on who you interviewed and what place you're in, it was like 5-10 names. You can imagine what happens when someone is kidnapped, that everyone around them feels paranoid that they're next on the list. So this sort of sense of what I call osmotic paranoia. And if you look at the quotation at the bottom of the screen, this is a doctor in Tijuana who talks about if a friend got kidnapped, he would give his friends up. He says he will talk because he'll talk. I am sure I would do it if I was in the same situation. I mean, I wouldn't blame him. He actually used the phrase referral in the same way as a doctor would refer to another doctor, to a consultant. So we have this betrayal of intimacy that's linked to kidnapping. That it's obvious that kidnapping negotiations are parasitic upon the feelings that people have for their loved ones, but they come parasitic upon knowledge about their targets, their movements, their vulnerabilities. So if you imagine during a kidnap and ransom negotiation, when the person who's doing it on the kidnapper side starts talking about what you own, go sell your vintage car. What about your relative in the United States? Get them to send you money. That this sort of says, well, who is passing this information on? And kidnapping's also action intimacy, because when the negotiations take place, payments of ransom would be dependent on proof of life questions. Asking someone that only the person who's been kidnapped knows is the condition of making the payment of the money. At the same time, the kidnappers will try and put pressure on the families through cruelty to those that they have kidnapped. This can be like cutting off body parts was one of the most common. And in some cases, that was all that the family members had at the end of the story, because the relative was disappeared, never seen again. So betrayal of intimacy is a key dimension of the phenomenon of kidnapping. Moving towards the intimacy distance paradox, this is going back to what I was saying about how to preserve the relationship, to preserve this affection, this intimacy, the special link that you have with people, distance became inserted in that relationship. And these quotations that are on the screen here are when this sort of idea sort of sprung out, or this, not an idea, this fact, this reality of the situation sprung out, because it conveyed the fatalism with which people approached the threat of kidnapping. And this is because if you're kidnapped once, or if you're kidnapped, the possibility is that other members of your family may be kidnapped, and it won't just be one ransom payment, it will be many. And it will go on and on and on and bleed that family dry, exhaust them, and have massively detrimental effects. So this NGO worker said to us, if you're taken, you're taken. We will sacrifice one, then sacrifice all. The idea of our family isn't to be extorted, so we don't ransom. So I can tell you that my family is one of those families that we will not pay a ransom. It is a security measure for the whole family, the extended family. Yes, it is horrible, but our family is a journalism family. We have different stakes of other families, and I understand that. And when that decision was made, I didn't even think twice of taking my kids away across the border to the US. So for this individual, once the threat became so pronounced, they made this conscious decision in the family not to pay ransom. And at that moment, her and her children moved across the border, and her husband stayed in Juarez. So what we see here is we hear about family separation on the border in the sense of the migrants and the separation of children from their parents. But we see a form of voluntary separation here to try and preserve the family unit, even if the family unit has some distance inserted to it and don't see each other the way that they normally do. And so this was the sort of trigger for thinking about this paradoxical notion of intimacy and distance. So rather than secession, the retreat into the homes, we see secession in the sense of retreating across the border. So this militarized border that we hear so much about became a way for Mexican families to insulate some of them from the risk. So what became called the Megxodus took place. And in cities such as Juarez, or such as El Paso, and parts of areas near San Diego, like Chula Vista, you have this influx of privileged Mexicans. And Chula Vista is called a gilded colony of Mexicans, where the restaurants moved, like some of the same restaurant names, they actually moved their whole operation across the border. And those who used to travel across to Mexico to see them or to go to visit them would go to them in the United States. And so you have this transborder mobility, these privileged groups moving through corridors of security. And what's worth highlighting is that it wasn't just, ordinary citizens that were doing this. One of our research contacts explained that he had actually gone to school with children of cartel members because it made sense for them to relocate their families too because of the risk. Now, the cost of this was the distance that was put in place as the NGO worker continues that she didn't have a normal life with her husband. And there was also another toll in the sense that there was a stigma attached to having abandoned their home cities. You know, they were away, they were the ones who had got away, but they had left others behind who didn't have that privilege to move across the border. And of course, culturally, they had to adapt to a new place. So the Transborder Secession gave rise to issues for those families who moved across. A loss of intimacy, a sense of guilt, a stigma attached to what they had done. And this continued in lots of other ways. Another person who I spoke with conveyed how many of the kids from that were in schools in El Paso, and it's the same with the University of Texas at El Paso, many of them travel across the border from Mexico. And for her family, that was a moment of relief. Knowing that she was across the border during the day meant that they could feel that she was safe for those hours that she was away. Even then, the families like hers who had kids who had crossed the border would receive phone calls saying that they had kidnapped their daughter because they knew that she was away from home and may not be able to be contacted. So what they call virtual kidnapping. So this sort of weird life where you feel relieved when your loved one is far away from you was a consequence of the kidnap risk. And then within the negotiations themselves, intimacy and distance was another feature of this, because on the one hand, these things are about matching pressure, trying to create delays, trying to get good outcomes. So it became for the families about harnessing the negotiators who could help them mitigate this emotional pressure, choosing someone from the family to be the negotiator, the direct contact who wouldn't cave into this and this very demanding pressure that was put on them. Sometimes it would mean hiring a negotiator from a different part of the country because you're worried the local negotiator might be corrupt. Relying on someone from outside to create this notion of distance, right? They're not from the place, they won't be contaminated by what was going on there. So the strategies of distanciation even continued into the negotiations themselves. And then the sort of final thing about intimacy and the way that this sort of, families were affected by this. I'll talk about this this image of the news story here in the letter that a relative of someone who's kidnapped and disappeared posted in a minute. But what struck us during the field work was, when someone was kidnapped, the relatives, often they didn't return. They would pay a ransom, but it'd still never be returned. For the family, a stigma became attached to that because of victim blaming. But because impunity rates are like 90+%, most of these crimes don't get solved. And in these situations, it's very easy for the narrative to be put out there that the person was kidnapped because they were involved in something that they shouldn't be involved in, that they're involved in organized crime, they're mixing with the cartels. So what that does is for those left behind when their loved one has been murdered or disappeared, the stigma gets accentuated, the isolation gets accentuated, the retreat into themselves gets accentuated. Many of them won't have even said anything when their loved one has been kidnapped because they're doing the negotiations. They've been told not to report it. They have to try and raise money when this negotiation is going on. They have to say the person who's been kidnapped is away on holidays or had to go away for work, all these things. So for some, the devastation was massive. They were isolated with the trauma of what they had done. In this case of the letter, it's a more inspirational story in the sense that this woman was very impressive respondent. When her brother had been kidnapped, she wrote a letter basically saying, "I'm leaving Tijuana and this is why." But it was a way of calling out to law enforcement as a way of trying to reclaim the honor of her family, which had been damaged by the victim blaming. And it was a way of sort of asserting a different narrative about the kidnapping. The word she used was, you can be the hero or the villain of your story. And one of the things we tried to do in the project is think about how we can try and build other narratives and overcome the victim blaming that gets associated with those who have been kidnapped. As we know in Northern Ireland, there's a lot of rumours put out when things happen about what may have been the reasons that they happened. So that similar dynamics occur in Mexico's borderlands around kidnapping. So I'd love to talk more and hear people's thoughts and questions about intimacy, distance, and kidnapping in the borderlands when I finish. But I thought it'd be useful to say a little bit more about the wider project. With this, I worked with Ernesto Schwartz-Moran, Camilo Tamayo Gomez was the postdoc. Ernesto led on a lot of the stuff to do with citizen-led counter-kidnapping. But in trying to help those that were affected by kidnapping, we did a couple of things. Produced a graphic novel, which was really a handbook that synthesized counter-kidnapping lessons that have been picked up through focus groups and workshops with people who had confronted this problem. Things like getting people to think about who would be the person who's doing the negotiations, who would raise the funds, what roles people would play within your unit, and to get people thinking about peer-to-peer security planning, what they would do if a kidnapping incident happened. We also developed an app which had a panic button, which had a mechanism to develop a security plan, a mechanism to report incidents. We have to say this is the bit that was most ambitious, but it's been the challenge. It's something we're still working on to try and improve. And one of the things that Ernesto's been doing is building simplified computer games that may do the same function. And also we held a kidnapping workshop that was one of, I don't know if it's the first big event on kidnapping, but it was bringing together researchers concerned with kidnapping and related forms of criminality from across the world to look at this and to try and advance this as a research agenda for the future. That's something I'm trying to take forward now. In terms of the project itself and what it is continuing on into, as part of Impact Acceleration for it, we've been working with grassroots filmmakers in Mexico called Verde Azul Producciones. And what we've done is we synthesized key themes and key trends from kidnapping stories that we learned through the fieldwork, fragmented them, and built scripts that getting turned into short series, each one 6 minutes, 6 of them, that are about kidnapping. 3 of them were done, and 3 of them still have to be done because whilst they're ready to be filmed, we couldn't do that because of the pandemic. But they're about breaking the taboos about kidnapping. The idea being that we're going to show these in schools and universities so that young people can watch them, talk about them in group with the objective that they then bring this home and talk about it with their families, and people start thinking about what they might do and overcome those taboos that we talked about, or that I talked about at the start of the presentation, and building new stories and new narratives of solidarity and resistance around kidnapping. So they're up on YouTube and up on Amor, Secuestrado, the first 3 there. We were really lucky to work with these grassroots filmmakers who produced like really fantastic work for a small amount of money compared to what these things would cost if we were using professional filmmakers. And they've really got the project and what we're trying to do. So there's other things which will flow from it, but that is it for my part of the presentation. Hopefully it makes sense, and hopefully I'll turn off the PowerPoint now and you can see me again.
Conor, thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. And such an academically rich project, but also in terms of the impact, it is truly incredible, the work that you're doing. I'd like to open the floor here. Someone is giving you a round of applause there in the comment bar. I would like to open the floor now for questions. I have a couple of questions myself, but if anyone else would like to start us off, please do. Yeah, go for it, Lauren.
Hi, Conor. Thank you. I find that
Hi,
really
Lauren.
fascinating. I was wondering perhaps if you could just say a little bit more of some of the challenges around doing the fieldwork in Mexico. I know you touched on the reluctance of the sort of taboo around talking about kidnapping in the first place, but if you could just say perhaps a bit more about that. And my second question was, I guess, about any sort of collective civil society mobilization around kidnapping. Obviously, you showed those images earlier on, and myself and Cheryl and Luke actually were all in Mexico City a few years ago for the Law and Society Association. And I remember being quite struck by that contrast between sort of the silence and secrecy around disappearance, but also these very public like images and posters and other installations in relation to the disappeared. So I guess, like, is there much of a collective mobilization against kidnapping? And I guess then where does, like the fear and the paranoia and all of those effects that you just mentioned, how does it impact upon that?
Yeah, no, great questions. On the fieldwork challenges, we were very lucky in that we had local people in each of the sites who were helping us. And I think that mitigated the issue of the security dimension. Like I never really felt they're insecure places, but we never really felt that insecure when we were there. The only time I felt insecure was when they got freaked out, which was when we were going to the anti-kidnapping unit, which is the police. And that was really strange. And I didn't feel insecure when I got there, but I remember when our local helper was getting nervous and checking, he said, call me as soon as you arrive. I was like, okay, we'll be careful there. As regards the issue of the challenge, I think for me, the big one was when you're interviewing people who have been through this, and often the relatives, and they have there's not a lot you can offer them, in the research process, saying we're trying to do something about this, but they have been down so many cul-de-sacs before, which haven't delivered. So it was a thing of trying to be honest and saying we have to do something about this. We can't promise magic bullets or miracle solutions. And also being conscious of not re-traumatizing people in the process. And like Camilla, the postdoc, had worked in Colombia with victims, and that made a big difference because he had that experience before. And I think also appreciating that that this was a citizen-led project, in a sense, that we wanted to hear what they were doing, what they thought would work. I think that helped in that process, because they could say what it was that they didn't have, and what they would have needed. The big problem for all these people was that they couldn't trust the police, they couldn't trust law enforcement. That was one of the biggest ones. On the collective civil society mobilization, there's lots of protests about kidnapping and disappearances, and I was at that conference itself as well, and that's Reforma. There's people out protesting. There's plaques. You see the color, the Mexican purple, linked to all these things about femicide, and there's all these things in public space almost everywhere you go about confronting it. But specifically as regards kidnapping, it's a little bit problematic because I think that the space of counter-kidnapping has been dominated, at least in sort of media, by the first wave of people who are kidnapped, so the elites. So what you have is certain maybe more right-wing, more wealthy individuals who are affected, who became the voices and figureheads of anti-kidnapping movements. Like there's one called Alto Secuestrado, Mexico SOS. Some of those have very problematic profiles within Mexico, and the colleagues, Ernesto, have a better grasp on that than I do. But what I realize is that it makes sense that when the first group that are targeted are the wealthy, then their agenda tends to shape it because they become part of it. As in many places, there are certain dominant victims groups, and control the narrative around these things. So that was the thing, that the people we were speaking to, a lot of them were outside of that. They were outside of the big sort of organized groups against kidnapping. So there's lots of protests, and I think the other thing is that I think the place of doctors was a very interesting thing, and that they were the first wave that they're targeted. And I think a doctor in a community has a sort of position, that I don't know whether it's of trust or whatever, but they were people that the public had confidence in. So there are big civil society movements and mobilizations, but getting the purchase, I'm not sure that they've had the purchase as some of those sort of more sort of first wave ones that are the wealthy elites. Those are the ones that will be on TV shows. Those are the ones who will be given more of a platform. And those are the ones who have been integrated into anti-kidnapping processes.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Claire, you've got your hand up as well.
Thanks. Hi everyone. Hi Conor, that was really interesting. I have to say, you're sort of talking about what was my backyard for a long time. I lived in Monterrey for 7 years. So it's not the border, but nearly. It's 2 hours away from the border. So it's like a border city. And everything you're saying makes a lot of sense in terms of what I heard about. I didn't have the pleasure of being kidnapped myself, I have to say. I don't know if that's insulting, that I'm not exciting enough to have been kidnapped, but I never was. So I'm relieved to have got out of that unscathed. But I just had a few kind of comments based on what you said. And like I say, from someone who didn't experience it, but obviously spoke to a lot of people about it who'd been through it or who knew about it. It makes a lot of sense what you're saying. And first of all, the issue of kidnapping itself, you know, that there's so many different phenomena lying behind the term. You know, one thing is being kidnapped by organised crime. One thing is being kidnapped by disorganised crime, by the state, as human traffickers, etc. And I think that in itself is a really big contribution to go behind that sort of detail, because depending on what lies behind the kidnapping, the sort of human rights violation is different and experience is very, very different, right? So when you're talking about elite kidnapping, that is obviously an economic, sort of generally an economic financial aim, but often it's who did that rich person annoy? Who did they kind of get on the wrong side of? Because everything is possible in Mexico. If you've got the right contacts, anything can happen or not happen, you know. So sometimes that's strategic, depending on if someone was annoyed politically or economically by that person, and it's kind of a punishment, I suppose. So I think kind of unpacking the detail behind types of kidnapping is really important from like a conceptual point of view and a human rights point of view. And in that respect, you talked about extortion, right? People ring up and saying they've got your family members. And when I arrived in Monterrey in 2013, so it was just past its peak of like violence. And people said that was what they were more aware of, or what they noticed more wasn't more kidnappings per se, it was the extortion surrounding kidnappings. There was like a paranoia about it. You know, people, like you said, some families would have their relatives far away in the States and they'd be happy because they knew they would be safe. But within cities where relatives were local, there was a lot of stress and paranoia about that. So I think what I would call a social imagination around kidnapping is important. I taught in a public university and I taught in a private university. And the private university, these are sons and daughters of very important people. You're not quite sure which side of the tracks they're on. And to be honest, there aren't tracks because everyone's in the middle of everything anyway, you know, whether they're politicians or police or drugs cartels, what's the difference sometimes? Anyway, so you don't quite know what's going on. But the point is kidnapping was an excuse not to hand in homework, for example. My uncle was kidnapped. So you're like, how can I check this? You know, how do you do a fact checking on a student not handing in homework? And obviously that makes it really complicated because you want to be kind, but you know, they're cheeky blighters and they do things like that too. So in some respects, kidnapping almost became like a bit of a joke at some point, you know, at least in that sector in Monterrey, because it was, you're not quite sure. That's my second point. I've got 2 more question points to make. One thing in terms of the impact on the elite, for example, one thing I noticed was that's a really short-term impact. People would go to the States and come back as soon as they could, because I think you mentioned somebody put on 20 kilos because of, you know, not going out, but you can put on 20 kilos a week in Mexico because of the food. People miss the food and they don't want to stay in the States necessarily. They want to come back, and that's a short-term impact. And also another short-term impact is this idea of being not so ostentatious about your wealth. I was so surprised in San Pedro, which is a really rich part of Monterrey. People would go about in their really posh cars and you're thinking, you're asking to be kidnapped, aren't you? You really are going around in that car. But the importance of showing and being a show-off in Mexico, because it's a very classist, materialistic society, is more important than the threat of being kidnapped. So people would go back to their old habits really quickly. You know, they might have been less ostentatious and suddenly it's get the Mercedes out because, you know, my neighbour's going to see me and he needs to see that I've still got my Mercedes, you know. So I would talk about short-term impacts because I was really, really aware of that. When I first arrived, it was a bit less ostentatious, and 2 years later, everyone was doing what they were doing anyway. And the final point I would make, and this is just an impression, but I wouldn't overestimate the novelty of people going from Mexico to live in the States for a while, because the wealthy families have been doing that for centuries anyway. You know, they've come and gone as they pleased, you know, for a certain amount of time. And one thing I presumed, I mean, like you were saying, that border is highly porous. It's one of the most transited, if not the most transited border in the world. And it's not just undocumented migrants, and it's not just very rich people. It's the middle class and lower middle class too. So there's plenty of people who've got the sort of right contacts, not high up, but to any level, to be able to move to and fro in a way that we would never imagine, I think. So I'm thinking in terms of that thing called running to the States, it's not, okay, I wouldn't see it based on my experience as the end of the world or something extraordinary. I saw it as much more ordinary than I would ever imagined. And you might have seen it. There's a really good film called Ya no estoy aquí, which is about Monterrey. It's about like a cholo, like a gang, not quite gang. And I think that, I mean, he's like a really low class, middle class person, and he manages to get to New York, and that's not uncommon. That's quite normal. Anyway, it was a bit of a rant, not a rant, it was a bit of a sermon, but it's quite close to my experience, having lived, and not having had the pleasure, but having lived next to this sort of phenomenon. And the final thing, is social media. The power of social media. On Facebook, my Mexican friends are always sharing disappearances, and what is that for intimacy, There's so much to say. It's a really, really interesting project, and I can't wait to read publications and what have you. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. There's a lot to get my teeth into.
Yeah.
So I think a couple of things I'd say. The typology is something that's a work in progress because there's just so many levels and layers to it. But the virtual kidnapping is really interesting because it became almost a banal thing that if someone received the call, they assumed it was a prank call, But what is interesting about those calls is that they basically show that the insecurity is such that if it was better to actually phone someone in the US who had relatives in Mexico who they couldn't check on, who would feel an amplified sense of insecurity. And that's what the pattern that we found. And the phrase that the law enforcement, US law enforcement, when we spoke to, talked about is they said, bad guys do the easiest things. It's a lot more easy to extort someone with a phone call than it is to kidnap someone, look after them, do a negotiation, all of that. What was interesting was some of these virtual kidnappings were being done from within prisons themselves in Mexico. On the issues of the impacts in the short term or the long term, I guess it's an issue of the specific cities. What we saw with Juarez and Tijuana is you see a population decrease in like the end of the first decade of the 2000s, and a big population increase in El Paso, in Chula Vista, in these places. So a direct correlation in the movements. And, the establishment of things, the establishment of some of those industries, the restaurants, the medical issues, things like that took place. So I don't know whether it's different. The proximity to the border might be, because they're right on top of the border, it might be a bit different. But no, great questions. And I think the social media is an interesting one. I think that some of my Mexican friends are almost immune to the images of violence because they are so bombarded with it on their social media as a matter of course, and in multiple ways, in gruesome ways. So for them, it's it's an everyday thing. It's mundane, at this stage. But no, really nice point. Thanks.
Thanks a million, Claire. Would anybody else like to come in with a question or comments for Conor? I have a question myself. And I was wondering, Conor, you'd said, and this is a little bit offset by Claire's point about kids using kidnapping as an excuse for handing in homework. But you had mentioned for the families of those who have been kidnapped, there's often a sense of stigma and shame, and that there's a degree of victim blaming going on there. And you'd mentioned about how you've been thinking about how to build other narratives to get away from that narrative of victim blaming. And I think that idea of victim blaming and countering that is relevant to so many contexts and so many different forms of crime. And I wondered if you could maybe just say a little bit more about what those alternative narratives look like.
Well, I guess like the example I used is the sort of strongest one, is that people actually don't share their stories about what happened, which is just the basic thing. So they end up retreating into themselves with the story, and it's giving them the outlet to share that in a way which doesn't bring the shame or accentuate the stigma. Because the issue with kidnapping that I find is if you went to Amazon or Google now and you put in kidnapping diary, kidnapping biography, you're going to see all of these journalists and NGO workers and Ingrid Betancourt and all these people who are really big, famous, elite celebrities. What we don't have is the stories of the ordinary people who have been kidnapped. And there's a sort of pejorative assumption that someone who's from a working class background is maybe more likely to have been involved in something dubious. And that's the thing that I think needs to be overcome. So more ordinary stories in the public domain, because the issue in Mexico is we're not dealing with thousands of kidnapped or murdered or disappeared. We're dealing with tens of thousands. And those stories get lost in the volume. And I think that's one of the issues that needs to be addressed. Finding the ways to do that. That's what we are trying to do with the telenovelas. But it's also something which I hope to do in the future is looking at the mechanisms that you can bring other, not the elite narrative, but the ordinary narrative of what happened out to a greater degree. The stories are just crazy when you hear them. They're like Hollywood films, even if it's not some celebrity for millions. And but yeah, a lot of them are hidden inside the homes of people.
Yeah, and I think there's so much value to bringing out those voices, but also, as you say, complicating that picture and adding in all of those layers. That this is not just something that happens to people in positions of prominence, but this happens to everyday citizens, and the effect is sometimes even more damaging if you were to quantify that in some way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that's such important to work with, and hopefully, COVID permitting, you can get back and do the telenovelas.
Yeah.
But we are kind of largely out of time. Does anyone have a last comment or question? I know we're unfortunately, it's bad planning on my part. We're competing with Social Legal Studies Association conference today. So I think people are dashing around all over the virtual world. But if there's no other comments or questions, I'll draw things to a close there for today. Conor, thank you so much. That was so thought-provoking. And I really look forward to seeing the publications, but also the impact work coming out of this. As Lauren said, when we were in Mexico a few years ago, it's such a prominent but also such a silenced issue, and to be able to alleviate some of that shame or that stigma is really incredible. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Not at all. My pleasure. So yeah, I think we will draw things to a close there, and thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Cheers. Bye. See you.
See you later.